Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. This is actually my first time in an AVPN conference, and I have to say that I'm extraordinarily impressed. It's been a really great week. There have been a series of activities during the week, and I'm really impressed by the dynamism, the energy, the creativity in the region, and I just wanted to really congratulate the team and all of the practitioners out here in the region. It's really been quite a great learning experience. So here, we're on the final day. This is the closing plenary, and we have a great lineup of speakers who I'll introduce in just a moment. We'll be discussing the very important topic of market system collaboration for more inclusive economies. So we know, unfortunately, that current market systems are actually not creating inclusive economies, they're actually increasing inequality. And we know that we need new models that can help drive us towards inclusive growth and inclusive economies. The question is, how do we get there? Because on one hand, we have our existing economic models that are really focused on financials and economics. And we see where that's been taking us, and it's not taking us in the right direction. On the other hand, we have a lot of social innovation. We have an increased focus on inclusiveness, and that's great. But the issue is, how do we connect these? How do we mainstream? How do we transform economic models and integrate and mainstream some of these social models so that we can move towards an inclusive economy? So, and also, what role does collaboration play between market stakeholders to help transform the markets to take us towards inclusive economies? So in this panel, we're going to talk more about what an inclusive economy should look like, what are the key characteristics, we'll look at some examples, and what are the target outcomes that we want to have with an inclusive economy, and how are we going to get there? So with that, I wanted to invite our outstanding panel to come up to the stage. First, we have Allison Wise. She's an associate director at the Rockefeller Foundation. Allison, please come up. Round of applause for Allison. Next, we have Harvey Ko. He's managing director at FSG. And Harvey will be talking to us about the role of markets and how to transform market systems. Allison will be sharing with us an overview of the great work that the Rockefeller Foundation is doing on inclusive economies. Next, we have Ahmed Watsiayan. He's a partner at social sector leader at Ernst Young. And Ahmed will talk with us about current trends and also the role of public-private partnerships and particularly the role of government. And finally, we have Alison Eskison. She's Asia Pacific Regional Director for the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. So we're delighted to have you here, Allison, as well. So we have two Allisons on the panel, spelled differently, but that's a good omen, I think. So let's get started with you, Allison. Can you tell us a little bit more about what Rockefeller Foundation is thinking about inclusive economies, and what are the characteristics of an inclusive economy?
Sure. Thanks, Karen, and thanks to everybody at AVPN. This has been a wonderful conference, and it's really an honor to be here. So the Rockefeller Foundation is one of the oldest philanthropies in the world. It was founded over 100 years ago with a global mandate, and today we have offices in Nairobi, New York, and right here in Thailand. At the Rockefeller Foundation, we are in the business of international development and social change. And our sole obligation is to our mission written into our bylaws, which is to improve the well-being of humanity throughout the world, with an emphasis on those who face poverty and marginalization. Now, this really broad mission gives us a lot of running room, and it's running room that, frankly, we need in the world today, because we are amidst so many changes. So, we've talked about it at the conference. There's this rapid proliferation of technology, the forces of globalization. They're all changing the realities that we see in the world. And at the same time that we're seeing these trends, we're also seeing core maxims that underpinned our economic development policy and practice fall down. So here I'm thinking of this notion, say, that growth will bring equality in the long term. Well, we know that that's not the case. So a few years ago, my colleagues and I at the Rockefeller Foundation looked at all of this, and we decided to step back for a little bit. And we asked ourselves a very basic question, which was, when we're designing and investing in economic interventions to improve the well-being of humanity, what is it that we are driving towards? And that's really where this notion of an inclusive economy came up for us. I want to acknowledge that you probably have heard the term inclusive economies or a like term. And there are many people that are thinking about this. We have good company with other foundations, practitioners that are asking the same kinds of questions. But what I'll do is I'll just talk about how we as an institution are seeing this notion of inclusive economies in the hopes that some of it resonates with you and you can take it with you. So at Rockefeller Foundation, when we think about an inclusive economy, we're really talking about 5 core characteristics, what practitioners in the audience might think of as outcomes. These characteristics or outcomes are growth, equity, sustainability, participation, and stability. Now, a couple of those you'll recognize as sort of the old standards, right? So growth, equity, sustainability, these are things that folks have been talking about in forums like this for quite some time. There's theory and there's practice about how to drive these outcomes. 2 in this set of 5 that do feel particularly novel and salient in today's context are participation and stability. So according to our definition, when we're thinking about participation, what we're talking about is really the ability for individuals to engage fully as consumers, as workers, as business owners. We're thinking about technology and the fruits of that proliferation being distributed widely. And we're also thinking about an economy where the rules of the game are clear. When we think about stability, we are thinking about having individuals, communities, governments, and businesses have the confidence that they need to make decisions that will affect their future. And this includes a better ability to predict the future outcomes of today's economic decisions. And so altogether, these 5 give you a really comprehensive view. I'm sure people in the audience are probably thinking, oh, geez, she listed everything there. And you'd be right. There's a lot packed into that definition of inclusive economies. But we feel, and we've seen as we apply this definition to our work, that having multiple dimensions can help challenge us to really think bigger and to see trade-offs that are associated with different approaches to intervention. And we also see that applying this framework can help us see more clearly where coordination and collaboration is needed to drive change in very complex systems that we work in.
Great, terrific. Thanks so much, Allison. And of course, collaboration is the theme of the conference, and we'll be talking more about collaboration during the panel. So Harvey, I know that you've been doing some work with Rockefeller Foundation and looking at examples and doing research on the role that markets can play in transforming systems. So could you share a little bit about that work? Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Karen. So where we came in was really partnership with the foundation on how we achieve this. So this utopian, vision that we have for society and the world we want to live in. How do we get there? Was the big question. So both the foundation and our team at FSG have been working on what we called market-based solutions, for about, a decade, a bit more than a decade. And we've been on this journey from working just with businesses and entrepreneurs to increasingly working with the ecosystem around those businesses, so including policymakers, civil society, infrastructure bodies, and so on. And this has really been the next step in that journey of thinking about how we affect market systems. So over the past year, we've been going around the world looking at instances where we've seen cases that have bucked the trend. So as Karen said, we're on this kind of move towards greater inequality, greater inequity, but we try to find markets that have kind of gone the other way. So we found specific markets, coffee in Colombia, tea in Kenya, dairy in India, water in Manila. Some of those may be examples that you've heard of, and really kind of get into those cases and understand how change happened. So not through an initiative or a program, but actually just looking at history and understanding how do different players actually cause those changes to be achieved towards greater inclusion. And we've really found three big themes which I think have important implications for the work that we do as an intermediary or that the foundation would be doing as a funder. So thinking about funders and intermediaries and our role in process of change. The first thing that I think is really important is that it's too easy to equate markets with business or with business players only. Whereas actually many of the changes that spur inclusion are about market rules, right? Laws, regulations, government policies, even social norms. What are the rules that actually govern behaviors in the market? And then how do they intersect with behaviors and business models in the market? Both of those have to move in order for markets to really shift towards inclusion in a significant way. The second thing that came to us was the tendency for us to think of innovation as the province of the private sector, right? So we think about social innovation, impact enterprise, all these new models coming up. And when we think about, say, the public sector, we see only blockages and barriers and challenges, Whereas actually, when you look at stories of change, there's a lot of innovation coming up from the public sector, from civil society, advocacy groups that are all part of the story of change. So we need to kind of broaden our conception of what innovation is and where it's found and who an innovator is, right, in order to really activate these processes of change. The third thing that we came to is we realized that when most of us get into thinking about systems and working in systems, we think, let's map the system, right? We all do that. The thing that comes from mapping the system is it tells you something that's a little false, which is you think that the system is static, right? Because you're taking a snapshot of the system in time, whereas actually systems are changing all the time. So if you look back through the history of the system, whatever system you're engaging with, it's always evolving and always changing. So the real way of thinking about how we affect systems is not that they're sitting there inert, static, waiting for us to change it, but actually that they're already changing and moving, and we're really just joining it at a certain point on its journey, right? So unless we understand that and how it's changing and where it's going, we will never be able to do anything about them. So where we're coming out of all of this is we have a report coming out in a few weeks' time, which we'll be sure to share with the AVPN team and get to all of you. Really kind of showing all the findings that have come from the research, but also some guidance for funders and intermediaries on how we can engage with market systems towards inclusion.
Great. Thanks so much, Harvey. I think that the Rockefeller Foundation framework is certainly very helpful, talking about markets and framing how you can get to inclusive economies. And then the question is, how do you implement it? So it's very interesting, the work that you've been doing, looking at practical examples on the ground. So I very much look forward to seeing the report. But of course, everyone's using the word system and ecosystem. How do you define that? There was a very interesting session yesterday talking about definitions of ecosystems. And we can only implement change if it's very specific. You gave some examples already, talking about certain sectors and certain countries. But how do you think about systems and ecosystems, and where are the boundaries, and as you're looking at the examples in this work?
Great question. So I think there's kind of two parts to that. One is kind of how do you define a market, and then the other is how do you define a market system. And so for our work, certainly the way we thought about it was it's a particular kind of product or service or factor or resource within a particular geography, right? So it could be certain kinds of services or products or even labor or producers within a certain country or state, because that's the way in which we thought many of the dynamics that play out around, say, market rules and laws, are set at the levels of countries or regions. And so those were kind of the meaningful unit to go to. And also that's where we saw change happen, right? And so that kind of provides a frame for us to go in. Also, that's kind of where many of us are interested in working, right? So we might have an objective around improving energy access, in a particular place, or around, better water provision in a particular place. And so that defines the market that we're looking at. The question about where the boundaries of the market system are a little kind of looser, right? So certainly they would include not just the businesses, but also government, civil society groups, community groups, all of those who have interconnections into either business practices or the rules of the market, or have a role in shaping them, certainly within this geography that you're looking at. Now, the other question is there may be players outside that particular geography who also have an impact. So in our stories, we see players like the World Bank or international donors, often coming in and transmitting influences, or resources, or even ideas and inspiration into those systems to help define them. I don't know who said it, but there was a kind of famous quote that said, wherever you draw the boundary of the market system, you've probably got it wrong. Or draw the boundary of a system, you've probably got it wrong. So I think part of this is also kind of starting with a boundary, but being open to connections that might be meaningful, maybe outside the lines that you've drawn.
And to your earlier point, these systems are dynamic, they're not static. So once you draw the boundary, it's already outdated anyway. Great. Okay, so now we'll turn to Ahmed to hear more about some current trends that might have an implication on inclusive economies, and also the role of public-private partnerships and the role of government.
Thanks. So just to say why I'm talking about government, as part of EY, we work mostly focused on government and public sector. And in a way are very closely involved on some of the points which Harvey is talking about how do we enable government? How do we help them look at right from the rules of the game to also ensuring that there's sustainability and predictability in the system to allow market forces to function. So, so my aim would not be to be too abstract. I'll try to be as real as possible. And let me start off with what was my experience when I was coming into Bangkok. I used to live in Bangkok. This time around when I came into Bangkok, I went in to take a taxi, and there was no person at the taxi stand. Technology had replaced people. So you take a receipt, you take a taxi, and you come. So there are fundamental forces in the markets which are at work right now, which are changing the way we are looking at inclusive economies. If you look at the World Economic Forum's report, for every one job which is going to be created, 3 are going to go away because of the disruption which is being caused by technology. What is the impact that will have on citizens? What is the impact it will have on jobs of the future? And is it going to create a destabilizing impact? Similarly, role of demographics. So we see some parts of the world where the elderly population want their golden era back and are sometimes voting in anger. I hope there is Chatham House rules. And then we see youth who are, again, asking for change, and sometimes, a generation gets wasted as a result of, the change not coming or resistance around new rules of games. And finally, the third piece around leadership, which is shaping geopolitics, that has a huge impact on how market works. A very recent example, of what is happening to, let's say, the aerospace industry in Middle East right now, because of what's ongoing, is a very good example of how changes can impact an industry almost overnight. So I think these were on my mind when I was thinking about what is really the role of the government and the public sector in enabling inclusive economies and, of course, enabling entrepreneurs. And I think these forces which I spoke about, technology, demographic, geopolitics, all of them can go positive or not positive, depending upon the type of framing and the type of rules of the games which are being set up by the leadership in the government. Now, I realize I'm kind of becoming a bit abstract, so let me try to make it a bit real by giving you an example. In India, in the food processing sector, currently it stands at about $252 billion, and food and retail industry is going to become a $480 billion industry by 2020. It is going to generate 9 million new jobs. But where are the jobs going to be coming in from? I do know from the work which we have been doing with the government in India that farmers are mostly 40 plus, 45 plus year old people. Youth don't want to be in that space. So obviously it would make sense to say, hey, can we put two and two together? Look at the youth coming from the farming family to look at this new job. But is the rules of the game supporting that? So if you look at previously, the emphasis was on mega food parks. Build big food parks, have a centralized system around it, and the economy would move. And I think one example I would like to give is how the government of India has started changing is the force they brought in are called Sampada, which looks at creating investments and entrepreneurs with mini food parks closer to where the production is happening. Now that changes the rule of the game, and it allows a number of people whom I have met, including in this conference, who have been working on entrepreneurship, etc., but entrepreneurs don't take off. The innovations remain as island of excellence because there is no pathway to scale. And that, I think, is very crucial when we are looking at the role of the government. The second bit which I want to talk about is in the global south. With the way the world is changing, the investment models and the financing model of innovation, especially relying heavily on multilateral, bilateral, and foundational funding, is changing significantly. The government has a role on promoting investments, and they have the wherewithal. But is there enough happening in that space? That's again another question. So in my opinion, I think there are three key areas which government should be looking at and has already started looking at in some of the countries. The first is that recognizing that technology, demographic, and geopolitics has an important role in inclusive economies, and responding to it in that manner and government can afford to be a little bit long-sighted in this rather than having a short-sighted approach. And I think we see some examples going one way, some examples going the other way. The second is really bringing a design or empathy-based thinking. I think with the advantage of technology, it's become easier to know from citizens and stakeholders about what they're thinking. And I think it is a great way of trying to develop policies or develop new rules around what type of business would be inclusive, what type of market can be inclusive. So I think that empathy-based thinking and empathy-based policy development is crucial. And the third part is creation of platforms where businesses, entrepreneurs, civil society, and of course government can co-create and participate. And that is again something which we have started seeing coming up and which is definitely something which should be done as part of a positive policy making. So those are my initial reflections about how do we really look at government creating this public-private space and which is not, which not increases inequality, but rather looks at creating an inclusive economy.
Great. Thank you very much, Ahmed. Just a quick question. Is it the role of government, do you think, to create these platforms? I mean, is it always, or should it also be, I mean, what is the role of the other stakeholders in the ecosystem? And I mean, sometimes it might be government that creates the platform, sometimes it might be other players. From your experience, what are the pros and cons of who takes the lead on that?
So when I say platform, it's about creating a space. And anyone can own that space and co-create and participate. Because I think a platform which is controlled and programmatic doesn't work. I think that's been the experience, as Harvey was saying, learning from the history. So here, I think the idea is what are the areas which can be opened up and which allow certain sections to focus on new things and certain sections to focus on getting it done. And I think that opening up of the space and ensuring that people see sustainability of that space. Because one challenge of having standalone platforms by one organization or the other is that people are not too sure whether it will last. And that's probably the advantage of creating a space. But I agree with you. I don't think, I have not seen an example where a tightly controlled programmatic platform works. Not really.
And the thing is, this is also a big mindset shift for governments to think about inclusive economies. So this is also one of the challenges. How do they implement some of these recommendations? But we can come back to that later in the panel. So finally, we're happy to have Allison here. And I should just note that it still has Nisha's name up there. Unfortunately, Nisha could not make it, but we're really benefiting from the chance to have Allison here with us from the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. I know you all have been doing a lot of work on inclusive growth, so we'd love to hear more about what's been driving that and what you have been finding so far, particularly about the role of collaborations.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm absolutely delighted. Why don't I start with just explaining why is MasterCard even in this space? So as a company, financial inclusion is in our DNA. We fundamentally believe from the executive leadership all the way through that MasterCard is about how to, or has a role in terms of financial inclusion. And to that, our CEO with the World Bank committed to financially including 500 million people by 2020, and we're nearly halfway there. So we're very excited and we're quite committed as a business. But as a testament to the company's vision, they took a step back and said, if financial inclusion is going to deliver on the promises that it says, we think that there needs to be an equitable economy, that's how you're going to genuinely realize all of those benefits. And so for the first 2 years of the center's existence, we focused on research. We tried to build the evidence base as to what is inclusive growth, what needs to be in place to have inclusive growth. And we worked with globally renowned universities to focus on creating that evidence base and developing a framework through which, over the last year, we've decided to start programming against. And so our programming focuses, programming through the Center for Inclusive Growth focuses in 2 different areas. And perhaps before I go into that, what we bring from the center is really the assets of the company. We bring the data, the technology, the expertise of the company, as well as the philanthropic dollars. This is the center's way, or this is the company's way of reconceptualizing what is corporate social responsibility. How do we make it so that it is both strategic and catalytic? And so the 2 programming areas that we have focused on is really pioneering the concept of data philanthropy, as well as how to grow micro and small enterprises. And I'll just take a moment to give you an example of both of those and how we're thinking about them. So on data philanthropy, MasterCard as a technology company sits on incredible amounts of data. And so we partnered with Harvard University and we gave them 5 years of anonymized and aggregated data. And we asked them to answer the question, many governments believe that tourism is a driver for economic growth. But is tourism really a driver for inclusive growth? And so Harvard took our data, layered it with a variety of other data sets, and said, okay, let's do a comparative analysis of 2 different countries. And they went in and said, how do foreign tourists spend their money when they go into a country? Do they go to the resort and stay on the resort and never leave it? And that's the only place they spend their money? Or do they actually go into town and help to develop the local economy? Do they travel in the country? How do they travel? Do they go to secondary cities and tertiary cities? In other words, how far out does that ripple effect of tourism actually help grow an economy? How does it help benefit all the different segments of society in that economy? And using our data and doing that comparative analysis, Harvard then went on to make policy recommendations to governments to say, if you want tourism to be a driver of not just economic growth, but inclusive growth, here are some of the structures and policies and regulations that you need to put into place to really extend that ripple effect so that you can see a true opportunity for participation across all the different segments of your society, not just the primary resort in a country. And that's a really exciting way that we think about how do you start to think about big data to answer questions or in an evidence-based way around inclusive growth. Another area that we're investing in from a programmatic side is around how to grow micro and small enterprises. And it's an exciting moment in Asia Pacific because the center has not had a deep presence in the region before. And so I've been looking and saying, well, what do I need to do in order to grow micro and small enterprises and grow them at scale, right? So I can't work with 1, 2, 3 micro and small enterprises and talk about it from an inclusive growth perspective. That you need to be thinking about it from the thousands and tens of thousands, because that's where you see the true growth and a dent in that equitable, or a dent in inequality. And so when we've been talking about it and we look at how do we approach micro and small enterprises, and we really started with the idea of, there are 3, 4 things that we see that enterprises need in order to grow. You need access to markets. You need access to financing. You need access to know-how. So do you understand your marketing? Can you manage your inventory? Do you know how to optimize the productivity? How do you recruit and maintain high-quality staff or employees? And as well as in some cases technology. And so we went in and said, okay, if those are the 4 things that we think that enterprises that have a growth mindset and the propensity to grow need, what can we do and how do we get to them and how do we get them at scale? And so we've been looking at it from 3 primary approaches. One is, how do we invest alongside like-minded businesses? So as MasterCard, we are sector agnostic and somewhat country agnostic. But so we are looking and saying, who are the like-minded businesses that are the anchors in their value chain, and are they investing in the small and micro businesses in their own supply chain? And if so, can we use some of our philanthropic dollars to help augment and add value to that? And the reason why is, if we work with a lead firm, the question about market access is answered. And then it opens us up to focus on the other aspects of, or ingredients that we think are needed for growth. If another way that we're looking at how to get to micro and small enterprises at a scale that's meaningful is bundling with the business. Right? MasterCard, as a technology company in the payment space, has a variety of different partners. So in some cases, how do you look at financial institutions that we've partnered with and say, well, who are you lending to? Who are the micro and small businesses that you want to lend to, but you're not yet there? And what do you feel their needs are in order to grow so that you'd be willing to move down market? And can the center go and work with, through partnership with NGOs, to help build the capacity of the micro and small enterprises so that we are satisfying the needs of the financial institution who's willing to lend to them? A third approach that we're really thinking about in terms of how do we reach out to micro and small enterprises is looking at the ecosystem, right? So providing access to finance is not the end goal. It's one step in that process. And to the degree that you believe that you need to have an enabling environment that works, you need to have policy that works, you need infrastructure that works, all the way through to market linkages and capacity building, are there ways for us to look at very traditional international development players who are pressing on all those other levers, and we go in and try to connect that synergy and say, if you're working in Nigeria on agriculture, and you're working on the policy side because you're a bilateral donor, you're working on infrastructure, can we go in and work on a piece that focuses on micro and small enterprises to help build their capacity? Because then we benefit from all of that really hard work that's also gone into place, and we're really able to leverage that, rather than MasterCard and the Center for Inclusive Growth taking a step and saying, well, we need to do it all. Because what we realize is that that's not our core competency, and that's not the space that we want to be in. Rather, we want to do it through partnership and collaboration.
Great. Thank you very much, Allison. Being from the OECD, when I hear someone talking about data and policies, it's music to my ears. But particularly when you were talking about the power of data and evidence, and you were mentioning leveraging big data, I mean, there are actually a lot of data sources out there that can be very useful to help us better understand the market and understand what the triggers are and what the impact is of different actions. And so I really would support your point about leveraging existing data. There are a lot of public data sources and that can be very helpful in informing work that's going on in this industry. And also about policy. We tend to talk about policies, but you were emphasizing the importance of the policy environment and the framework conditions. And again, we've seen at OECD how important it is, and that can be the make or break for being able to implement any of this. Speaking of implementation, we now want to move to another round of discussion, looking at examples of what's been happening and what can happen and how we can move forward to actually move towards the inclusive economy. So, Allison, could you talk a little bit more about some of the examples that you've seen through Rockefeller Foundation?
Sure, and maybe I'll just give one, and it's one that's dear to me. I've been working on it for the past year. So at Rockefeller Foundation, we have a team that is thinking about employment in the U.S. And we were looking at trends in the U.S. labor market. And we saw something that's pretty shocking. So today, 25% or more of the U.S. labor force could be considered as free agents. So these are people that are employed, self-employed, but might go into a company and provide services to that company. So think, say, a janitor that is contracted to support, an office building. It also includes people that might be, freelance designers on the higher end of the income spectrum. It could include people that go into domestic employment situations as care workers. Or it could include people that are, giving you rides places through a platform like Uber or Lyft. This is significant, and so when we saw this trend, we decided to spend some time thinking about it and thinking about how we could leverage the trend to really promote more inclusive economies. So that led us to a place where we decided to see the trend using the different characteristics. And here's a few things that we found when we did this exercise. So growth. If you look at job growth in the past 10 years, there's some academic studies that show that the majority, if not all of the job growth in the past 10 years is due to this kind of, these kinds of employment agreements. So you could think that that's good, right? Because we want jobs in the economy. But when you dig a little deeper and you look at the equity characteristic, you find something that's interesting. So at the higher end of the income spectrum, folks love this, right? So your freelance designer is saying this is great. They might have a financial cushion that allows them to deal with any sort of spikes in the jobs that they get. They might be able to better navigate their lives. They have more flexible work hours. They are their own boss. This is great. On the lower end of the income spectrum, this is actually quite devastating. For so many folks that don't have that cushion, having this income volatility means episodic bouts of poverty. It means insecurity, which leads us to this stability characteristic. Stability is something that so many of these workers, in that 25%, don't have. And so this is an example of where taking the framework and applying it to a trend can help us as a foundation better look at the system and think about ways of intervening. So in doing this exercise, it raised good questions about collaboration for us. So for example, on the growth end, if we know that these kinds of jobs are growing, a question that we want to ask ourselves is, how do we work with employers that are using these kinds of employees, these free agents, to make those jobs good jobs? On the participation aspect of this, we're thinking to ourselves, okay, if people are accessing their incomes and accessing their work through these types of agreements, do they understand the implications of working in this way? Something that we found is that actually no. Our tax systems were set up for different forms of employment, where employers were, taking on some of the tax responsibility. Our tax system was set up to provide safety nets for low-income workers that were employed in these traditional agreements, but not in these new ones. So free agents that are low income don't have access to things like an earned income tax credit, which is a way that our government thinks about supporting low-income people. And these independent workers, this new crop of workers, they don't tend to know this. They don't know the rules of the game. So when they're faced with a decision between one job that is, traditionally classified as not being independent, that pays, say, $15,000 a year, and then another engagement that might pay slightly more, say $20,000 a year, but is an independent contract, they don't have the information they need to make good decisions. So that helps us think about ways in which we could intervene on the policy side to address the issue. Then, of course, on the stability front, we're thinking, okay, if there's income volatility, are there social entrepreneurs out there that are thinking about new products and services that can help these workers smooth their incomes and build assets? So going through this exercise helps us just see the system in a different way, in a more nuanced way, and plan out how we can best deploy our philanthropic dollars to address the issue, given the trends that are already in motion, to Harvey's point about systems being dynamic.
Great, thank you for that. We now would like to talk further about collaboration in the market, and starting with the funders. How are they thinking about inclusive economies, and what sort of actions are they taking?
So I think there is growing interest amongst funders in thinking about markets and how they could be leveraged for impact. There certainly has been a lot of activity in thinking about livelihoods and how you facilitate better livelihoods for poor and marginalized populations. There's probably been less activity around beneficial goods and services for poor and marginalized populations. There's probably more work to be done there. And I'm thinking both about aid funders as well as philanthropic funders in that space. I think the bit that's still a huge gap is really this focus on inclusion in its broader sense that Alison was introducing, and I think for us that was also a big kind of aha moment, that actually we might be focused on providing a good thing like, energy or water or healthcare to a population, but are we really thinking about who's getting it, who's benefiting from it, in all that ways? Is it okay if we get it out to people, but it's not getting to a certain caste or people with disability, or is it okay if we exacerbate certain inequities and disparities in the system? Is it okay if we get it out there, but we're causing damage to natural resources that makes it less sustainable in the long run, and we're kind of robbing future generations to pay for today? I think those are blind spots that we need to try to minimize, as we go into this work. So I think one of the challenges facing funders is how do we move from just having the single goal, when we think about market systems, and actually move towards a more holistic idea of kind of what it is we want to see at the end of it. I think if you start engaging in systems change, you have to really ask yourself what kind of system you want, at the end of it, and what you're helping the system to move towards. The other aspect that I think people really need to work on, and this is both funders and intermediaries, is what kinds of teams do we have to be able to do this work? So as I said earlier, we have a tendency to equate markets with business, and so we create these teams to do markets work that's full of business people or people from the business world, and I speak as someone who kind of came out of that world. But where are the people who understand public policy? You know, where are the people who understand governance? Where are the people who understand, you know, social dynamics and social movements? Because actually those are all parts of the stories of change. And unless we can engage with all those different parts, we're not going to be able to make change, right? It's more than just business. So I think we need to maybe look again at kind of what skills we've got, what capabilities we've got within our own teams and who we partner with. And then the final thing that really comes up for us as a challenge, and this is funders working individually as well as working together and working through intermediaries, and we covered this a bit this morning in our workshop, is we tend to work too rigidly, really, to engage with systems, right? So because systems are complex and you can't predict what's going to happen before you get into it, you know, you can't follow this kind of classic approach where you spend, you know, 4 months developing a strategy and then, you know, lock yourself into a plan with rigid kind of activities and milestones and goals for, you know, 5 years. Of course, you can have a plan and a strategy, but that's going to evolve and has to be adapted as you get into it and actually work with the system and discover, you know, constraints and opportunities within the system. And I think that is quite challenging, you know, for many funders. I mean, particularly kind of in the aid world, but I think also in the philanthropic world. And so one of the challenges, I think, for us as a sector is how do we evolve new adaptive ways of, you know, obviously monitoring results, but also learning, right, as we go through it. And a lot of this comes down to trust. You know, we've got to build better, stronger relations of trust between funders and intermediaries who are working in these systems to really make progress.
Great, thank you. Amit, Harvey was talking about the role of the different stakeholders. What examples have you seen of collaborations on the ground in terms of actually reaching some of these beneficiaries, particularly the poor and the vulnerable?
So let me talk about something which I'm currently involved in. So let me start off with a bit of a background on this. I go around, you know, in many conferences, I hear about social enterprise as the answer to a number of changes. Especially in education, there is a lot of talk which happens about, okay, we are working on this solution, that solution. But there are a couple of things which I've always noticed. That a number of these social enterprises are operating in what I would call, you know, good markets, not thin markets. So the markets are not good enough, you know, if you're looking at far-flung areas, you know, if you're looking at Indonesia, so you'll see a lot of social enterprises around Jakarta, but not enough in West Papua. If you are working in India, you'll see them around Delhi, Mumbai, South India, but you would not see them in a Jharkhand. So what would it take to look at areas where real poverty, real issues still exist, and we see the impact of inequality, and where you know, the new wave of social enterprises or thinking is not reaching, or even the private sector is not reaching. So we have been involved as EY, we have been involved in working for government of Jharkhand, which is one of the most underdeveloped regions, I would say, in the world, on helping them transform their higher and technical education system. Now let me explain why that is very important. I was talking earlier about jobs. Every year, Jharkhand, 500,000 youth get enrolled into government, you know, higher and technical institutions, and most of them belong to, a number of them belong to the, you know, the underprivileged category. Most of them know that they have no future with that education which they are getting into, so they would, after that, they would drop off, and then what? Then what would happen typically is another round of government training program would happen, which would re-skill them and then get them ready for the market. So this is a classic reactive response which is happening, that because the earlier market system on higher and technical education is not working, we have added on a band-aid you know, solution. So we started working with the government on how to do that transformation. And to be very honest, government was very willing and was trying to say, look, we know we have a problem. We've got 8 colleges for every 100,000 students. We've got teacher to students ratio of 54. So which obviously means at one level it's unsustainable. So the first step was, and while they were doing that, this is a new state which has been created, so had a lot of legal problems in terms of the statutes and the regulations of the higher and technical education. So as a result, believe it or not, the system was not able to move forward because of the number of cases which were put on them. So the entire department and the professors were running around the court responding to the contempts and responding to the writs which are against them. So at a very practical level, it was about how do you get those down so that there is a space for, breathing space for the government to start writing the new rules. Rationalization of courses. Is it really needed that all the courses need to be taught everywhere? Can we look at rationalization? And this is a place where government enters into a direct issue around politics. A course might not be needed, but is it something which is going to be allowed? There is that negotiation and platform discussion which needs to happen between the teachers union, the students and the government, and also the industries to come in and talk about saying, in this area we are interested in this course, and in this area there is no future. And how do you get everybody to then move towards in the same journey? Then comes the point about looking at, are these courses really accredited? Getting them ready, getting them up and running, really helping them prepare, because that is what is good. That spade work is needed to rewrite the rules of the game. And it will allow, let's say, second shifts to happen, which would allow most students to be taken up. And then what rules need to be written to bring in greater private investment? So a lot of my time went out going out and convincing private universities that it's okay to come to this place. There's no threat per se or perceived threat. Come in, and there is that investment which is needed, and all of that is really needed. And so that earlier I was talking about government's direction, government's commitment to start creating that space, writing rules which allows it to attract all sorts of stakeholders, and then create to start with a regulatory space which allows for innovations to happen, so which doesn't get in the way in a way. So that, I think, is a very powerful experience which I've had of how a government has been trying to remove the cobwebs which are in the path of creating a more inclusive growth, which creates positive impact and which removes reactive or ad hoc solutions.
Great, thank you. So we can see how complex these collaborations can be, but how important they are to really drive towards change. So very quickly, Allison, because I wanted to give the audience a chance to ask a couple of quick questions. What are the incentives for business more broadly to engage in inclusive economies?
Absolutely. So partly why MasterCard created the Center for Inclusive Growth is we look at it as a long-term investment for who will eventually become MasterCard customers. How do we ensure that there is a reduction in inequality? Because as more individuals and businesses grow, they are more receptive and desiring of a MasterCard product. So it's a long on-ramp. Do we think that the businesses that we support today, tomorrow will be getting a MasterCard? Likely no. However, going forward, we really hope that this is seeding our future as a company. And I guess, since I have the microphone, one thing I wanted to add onto what Harvey had said was about flexibility and funders being able to remain flexible despite having a strategy. I think that's absolutely right. I would also go one step further and say risk-taking, because I think that there is an increasing hesitation to think about a variety of different solutions. And here we've talked a lot about technology throughout these last couple of days. And I think that's an incredibly powerful tool and opportunity. And as a technology company, we fully believe in it. But I think that there's also low-touch opportunities that shouldn't be dismissed.
Great, thank you. So I know we don't have much time because I promised we would end on time, even though we started a little bit late. But are there a couple of questions that the audience would like to put to the panel? I'm then going to ask the panel to give some concluding remarks and recommendations, but they can wrap in answers to your questions into that because they're such a talented panel, so I'm sure they can. Any questions from the floor? Yes, please.
Good afternoon. I would like to specifically address my question to Allison from MasterCard. Actually, we work with marginalized communities, and one aspect that they need is markets. So after coordinating with various agencies who would provide good packaging, good technology, the next is market. So we were able to convince an investor to put up an online shop. So the online shop is already there, but after we have established the online shop, they can pay through MasterCard. But then the ransom virus got popular. So how do you help us strategize so that we can manage the situation and then sell through the online shop again?
Okay, maybe that's a question for after, I don't know. But let's take a couple more questions, and then we will have the panel go through for the closing remarks, and you can pick up then. Are there a couple more questions? Yes, here? There's a microphone on the way.
Hi, Suzanne Beagle. You talked about bringing a lot of new kinds of stakeholders together, and I think, what do you think about the importance of funding and really thinking about the capacity building for those different kind of stakeholders to come together if they're not traditional actors in the systems that we've been building? And how to approach that?
Great, thank you. Good question. Is there any other last chance? It's hard to see out there. Okay, I don't think I see another hand. So then what I wanted to do is ask each of the panelists to, first of all, answer the questions that were put forward, but also to give a brief recommendation about how to move forward with market system collaboration and how we can make our economies more inclusive. So starting, Allison, with you.
I'll take a stab at answering your question. So I think there's kind of three ways that I've seen our institution do this, and I'm sure there's more, so I'm open to ideas from others and looking forward to hearing how the other panelists think about this. But I think I've seen success in bringing folks together to collaborate by funding intermediaries and networks. So for example, we love AVPN. We love that we're having this conversation. We think that they do great work in bringing people together, like all of us here today. That would be an example. We fund convenings and we fund network organizations. Another way that I've seen good collaborations come together with unlikely partners is through different strategies that have been built by actors in the field like innovation labs. So we have a team, and I'm happy to give you their information if you're interested, that think about this a lot and think about different methodologies for bringing folks that touch problems from different angles or think about problems in different ways to come together and over a period of time strategize and understand ways that they can work together. Innovation Labs is one of them, but we have a toolkit that outlines 12, and there are some really talented partners in the innovation space thinking about this, so I'm happy to connect afterwards.
Terrific. And actually, I realized my watch is fast. We have a little tiny more time than I thought. So let's first answer the questions, then we'll come to the closing comments. I think Ahmed wanted to jump in, and then Harvey, if you wanted to come in.
So, I mean, I second the point which Alison was making that, networks play a very strong role. And I would echo the point about AVPN. I think it's an excellent space for I think, a very diverse set of people who are trying to find solutions to come together. The other thing which I've noticed where the question was where funding can go to is also on working, of course, on incubating innovations, but at the same time, or also recognizing, at least in my view, I've seen that many times governments in middle-income countries are expected to have the budgets, but many times, and they have got large programs, but they don't necessarily have the flexibility to bring in the type of insights which is needed, or you would call that technical support, or you can call that advisory or insights, which is needed for them to leverage the very large investments which they're making in this space. So as a result, that entire investment starts, kind of either getting stuck or not moving forward. So I think that's another space which is about enabling government in a smart manner. And I think there are some foundations which do it quite well, and there are some, who are thinking about it. The third place where I feel there is a need for funding investment is really on looking at how knowledge is managed. So networks do manage knowledge, but historically, I think in the new age which we are looking at, personally, I do not really have a perspective on this, because every 2 years I see a new knowledge platform. So there was, coming up. But it's really very important to be investing in that and to look at how knowledge can be made easily digestible. Somebody was saying earlier in the morning that any innovation which we're talking about probably has been done somewhere before. So can we learn from that past, and can we look at a 50 seconds capsule of somebody's 60 years of learning, and can that be made available? And I think that's a place where investment needs to go to if we want to avoid the mistakes of the past.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. And unfortunately, everybody wants knowledge, but no one's willing to pay for it. But it's a very important point. Yeah. So, Harvey.
So I want to second Amit's point about supporting people, particularly working in government, because obviously I'd said there's innovation coming from all these different sectors, but the way you support them can be quite different, right? So you might think about funding or investing in an entrepreneur, right, to run their business, but you're not going to do the same thing with the policymaker, right? So how do you provide the right kinds of supports to different kinds of innovators in different parts of the system? To come back to networks, I don't know, we're not just saying this because it's AVPN, you've got network in the name, but one of the ways I think we can really support them is by actually connecting those innovators, right? So it can be quite lonely if you're an innovative civil service, working in the machinery of government, and you're trying to do something different, something new. And so connecting them to like-minded people, around the systems that they're working in can actually be really helpful for them, and helpful for changing the system. And one of the things that we found from all of our work, looking at how change has actually happened, is there's kind of a time and place for collaboration, I would say. Collaboration can be a good thing where interests are really aligned and that there's a real strong reason to work together. But actually what we found that was more important than actual collaboration, where everyone kind of signs up to the same roadmap and goes together, is actually just social capital and connections, right? And often what we see is that at certain points, different agents in the system decided they had something in common, and decided to do something together and move the system to the next stage. It wasn't a formal partnership or a formal long-lasting collaboration, but it was, a meaningful action that moved it along. But the thing that made it possible was interconnection, right, between those different kinds of players. And what was interesting for us was reflecting on our own practice, and thinking about these different kinds of actors. We realized that as funders and intermediaries, we're very, very comfortable supporting organizations. We're not as comfortable supporting individuals, or not as good at supporting individuals, and even less good at supporting relationships between individuals, right? And those are all the pieces we need to take care of.
I think you're absolutely right. And let me give you, I think the power of networks is incredibly important. And I would echo everything that's been said. Let me give you 2 examples of when we think that it's worked well, and where it's just hasn't quite worked out, and we can't quite figure out what to do about it to correct it. So on one hand, in terms of how do you connect those synergies, right? So that you're able to really unlock and unleash the full potential. So in Nigeria, MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth partnered with DFID. They had a $50 million agriculture program that worked on a variety of different things in the way that strong international development programs often do. And so we went in and said, what can we do to add value? And what they came back and said to us was, tomato farmers in Nigeria who grow it in the north and transport it to the south lose 50% of their tomatoes because they stack the tomatoes on top of one another in raffia baskets, stack the baskets on top of one another, put them on the truck, and then ship it off. And so what farmers really need to increase their income is to provide or to put in plastic crates. It's a very low-touch intervention, and as the Center for Inclusive Growth, we looked and said, "You want us to buy plastic crates?" And they said, "Absolutely." So we went and we did a market assessment of what's the demand for plastic crates. We bought 25,000, which was a sheer fraction of what was needed. But what the implementer for this development program did was went directly to the processing plants and got purchase orders to bypass some of the middlemen so that the farmers not only saw a 50% increase in their income because they had more produce to sell, but also were cutting out some of or taking more of the value add. And interestingly, on top of that, this incredible plastic crate rental market just cropped up. And all of a sudden, the market forces started to take over. And it's an example that is interesting in terms of us being able to leverage and partner what was already being done. And one example, very quickly, as to a way where we feel like it should work and yet it can't, and it's more from the business side. So there are a variety of donors that put out challenge funds or calls for expressions of interest because they want to leverage private sector money. And we have, across the board, sort of talked about them saying, well, that's interesting, and we can develop the product and we can put in the co-funding as a business. But it's a very odd experience to go into a partnership where the donor is saying, well, we want you to put in money, but you have to actually apply to us, and then we're going to decide whether or not we want to do that. Because we're not set up to do those sorts of proposals. And so even when we work with an NGO, it's still this odd relationship. And it's that opportunity to connect those synergies that is not quite there yet. And I understand that many people look at the private sector and think of it as an extra piggy bank to answer some of the development challenges, but there's so much more that I think we can bring, that we want to bring.
Great. So unfortunately, our time is up, but we wanted to have the very quick recommendations from the panel. We'll start with you, Allison. Very brief.
Absolutely. I think that partnership is absolutely critical, and if we're going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, then we need to think about partnership in the most expansive of ways.
Amit?
I think, as I was saying, we need to be rethinking about how is, instead of telling governments what to do, governments have the resources, but how are they going to become an active participant in this conversation? And how do we enable them to achieve inclusive economy is going to be crucial to what we achieve in the future.
Great. Harvey?
So I guess my final thought is to not be daunted by the scale, and the challenge of what we've been talking about here. What we've found through our work is that against this backdrop of inequity, positive change has occurred. It is possible. It has happened. And I think that should give us, confidence and inspiration to see what we can do. And also that we don't have to, figure out everything about the market system before we can do something or try to solve everything about it. It is about creating maybe a better awareness of the system that we're in and then figuring out how we can best act.
Great. So Allison, you have the final word.
I guess I would say that there's something to be gained by pausing before you seize an opportunity or address a challenge. Pausing and thinking about that opportunity or that challenge from as many lenses or as many angles as possible, even if you're just going to choose one, because doing that exercise might trigger some innovative thoughts or trigger some thoughts about who you need to be talking to or collaborating with as you go along in your journey.
Terrific. Thank you. Well, it's been a great panel discussion, a lot of great ideas, and also some concrete steps that can be taken to move forward, even though it is a big and seemingly daunting task. And we very much look forward to this report to see examples of how it's been done and put in practice in other regions and sectors. So let's give our panel a big round of applause. Thank you.